Today's lecture is called WHRI Analytical Framework, Bridging the Gap Between Research Question to Publication. As part of my work as senior statistician here, I actually read a lot of study protocols, research proposals, small and large one, and papers. And I thought it will be cool to put all my knowledge together, like how to develop research question, how to write study protocol, how to do properly the hypothesis testing and build your hypothesis, and how use all this information, ground information and background that you already created to publish a paper that it's acceptable without a lot of reviews. So my goal as statistician, actually, when I work on the papers, to be at the stage that I'll rarely get comments related to statistics. And if I get them, it's because usually reviewers didn't exactly understand what we did, or some small things. So I thought basically, let's put all this information together. And so, because different researchers have, this WHRI have different backgrounds and different aspirations and knowledge, it will be great to have kind of analytical framework with all the documents. Please note that all the documents, it's my perspective. So I am sharing my experience and my knowledge with you. So if you Google or go to different resources, you might find something different. But this is how I do my research and write my papers. So objective of today's lecture, basically, I will introduce the framework. So I briefly talk about documents that are available and what is in documents, but it's not a lot of details because documents are relatively long and detailed, and there are also a lot of examples and tips and links to resources. So it will be very hard to put everything in 20, 30 slides. So basically, I present some of the components and key stages of the research through this lecture, and actually explain what are next step to add more resources and what we're going to do in the future, through the summer and next year. So thanks to Olivia, I have a new statistical resource page that look very cool and very organized. It's really easy to find the information. So basically, the new page includes guidance and tools from research ideation to publication. So basically, we'll have links to all the documents, developing a research question, why write a study protocol, guidance for hypothesis testing framework, and publish with purpose, how to write the research paper. And again, this is my perspective on the issues, from my experience. It's not necessarily that everyone thinks the same way. So also, we organize all the lectures in order and by lunch and learn, statistical series, summer scholars. So all the lectures are organized in chronological order. And in addition, if you remember, as part of newsletters in eBlast, there were Sabina's Corners with my tips. So now all those documents are downloadable from the resource page. For example, I did one about box plots before that visualization lecture, or after distribution, there's one explaining what is central limit theorem and so on. So all the information that I presented and wrote until now, it's available on this page. So you are welcome. You're welcome to go to this page and review the documents. And of course, if you have questions or you think something else can be added, please email me and let me know. So analytical framework, again, what it's included, those are 4 documents that I included and that I'm going to talk about. So first, we're going to talk about research question. So why strong research question matter? Because the research question is actually the only thing that shape your study design, methodology, analytical plan, and your final output at abstract, thesis, paper, presentation, whatever you're aiming for. It drives the entire process of the research. So basically in your paper, from introduction to discussion, everything else will be based on your research question and how you structured it. We need to ensure that research question is clear, feasible, and well-informed question keeps you paper focused and aligned. So basically, we need to understand what we want to do, but we can have like all those crazy ideas what we want to do, but it also should be feasible. Feasible means within specific time frame, budget, resources, we can achieve the goal. Because if research question is not feasible, it will be really hard to get to the final product. So basically, in addition, research question also sets a stage for ethical conduct, valid interpretation, and impactful conclusion. So basically, if we design our research correctly and develop really rigorous and interesting research question, the process should be very flowy and one thing will lead to another. I already presented a lot of those things in my first lecture about data, garbage in, garbage out. So I talked about like what is data, what are data, and research question and data management plans. So some of the information I'm going to present, I already talked about it. So basically this lecture, I talked about what makes research question strong. And you have the link from where I took the pictures. I also have additional information about this topic. The research question should be specific. So it should be clear and focused. Feasible, as I said, realistic in scope and resources. Original or relevant means address gap in real world issues. Complex and arguable invites analysis, not yes answer. So basically when develop research question, it should be something rigorous and interesting, not like something simple. Although some research question like for, I don't know, your project in university for your master degree sometimes will be less complicated and maybe will end up as yes, no. But here we're talking kind of questions in research environment. And also research questions should be researchable and focused. So basically, we should understand how we're going to collect data to answer the question and what we're going to focus on. So everything should be kind of is in the circle related, and we need to think through about all those things to have a good research question. So what are steps for research question? So most of us have job with specific title and are assigned to specific units. So probably our research question will be relevant to our field of work or field of study. But even within your field, if you develop your own research question, you need to choose field of interest or emerging issue, kind of something new in the field or what you're interested about. You need to examine trends, gaps, and personal relevance of the question. If you're interested in this question and how this question will have to narrow the gaps or explain the trends in specific environment. So what usually you start from? To get the idea, you need to conduct literature review. So literature review can help you to locate gaps and consistencies and unexplored areas. You can use different types of research like published research, publications, abstracts, like in empirical tools or theoretical tools. But very often great literature can be great help, and great literature basically for me, it's everything they publish. It can be journals and social media posts, and different sources on websites. So basically something that can give you an idea. Actually, I sometimes do posts on LinkedIn, and like whatever I see other people post, and if there's like something problematic or interesting, I said like, oh, this is really cool. I need to write something about it so people will learn. So basically it's how I get inspiration for my ideas and my posts. you also need to, like when you do the literature research, review, you need to evaluate the study quality, representativeness, and theoretical framework. So a lot of things are published nowadays, and actually it can be a good paper and can be a not so good paper. And when you do literature review, you need to read it very critical. Say, oh, is a study really have a high quality or interesting? Is there an appropriate theoretical framework? Is what hypothesis tested correctly? How it represents population you would like to research? If there is any limitations, every study will have limitations, but we need to think like, oh, as those limitations can cancel all the results, so actually the limitation explain why we need to review the results of the paper publication in question. So in the document, literature review can include different types of reviews. So for thesis, PhD thesis, someone might start with meta-analysis or other types of analysis. So depending on how large you on a small you project is, you can decide which type of literature review you should use, and it's actually explain, a lot of them explain what you need to do to have a good results. Identifying a broad topic and mapping opportunities. So first of all, we need to develop a broader idea what we would like to do. We need to identify unstudied populations, which variables we can include, or what relationship you would like to look at. And we also can incorporate recent social trends and technological trends. Like, I am a very organized person, and I like tables, graphs, and flowcharts and diagrams, even not on the computer. Like here, I think I got give example of Gantt chart, but I'm not a big fan of this one. I think it's more like related to project management, but any type of flowchart, tables, pros and cons, I think like when you read and do literature review, you need to systemize your ideas and information to identify the gaps and trends and what is unknown and where is opportunity to bring something new. So the most important thing for me when you develop a research question, it's PICO framework. PICO framework basically includes very simple things into it. If you want to develop good research question, you need to know your population, demographics, settings, inclusion criteria, intervention, what you're going to do, treatment, dose, delivery for like clinical trials, or you want to look on your population longitudinally, or you had a retrospective cohort and you would like to compare something. But there should be something, as I say, meet to your research question, what intervention or changes you would like to see within this research. Also, we need a comparison. Yeah, a lot of papers can be like descriptive paper. Yes, you can have, oh, no one describes this situation. I didn't find any papers about it. Now I'm going to first describe this population, and it will be my first paper, and later, based on the descriptive analysis, I'm going to develop more rigorous comparison. But as most of the papers we do, and as most of the study design, there is some element of comparison. Also, we need to have outcome, something relevant, measurable, and time-bound. So if you use PICO guidance step by step, it will help you develop your research question, because kind of you divide in your idea for very simple steps that later can be put together to something meaningful. So, and in the document, I talk a lot about PICO questions, PICO research question development. So basically, I write examples for different types of study design. For example, what is PICO for clinical trials? What can be PICO research question example for longitudinal science? It's very detailed, so you can use the guidelines like to help you develop question. What additional consideration we should have reviewed or include in our research question? We always, when we do, I think it's the most important thing in data analysis and research, our research should be ethical and we should respect confidentiality and legal standards. It's the most important thing. Also, when you develop your research question, you usually think about what data you're going to collect. So, and here I also talked about it in my first lecture. You can incorporate what we call fair data principle. So basically what it means, and on the picture I explain it in more details, it's the data also should be findable, accessible, we can easily interpret it, and we can also reuse it. Yeah, so findable, for example, data and supplementary materials have sufficient enriched metadata. So basically, metadata is basically data about the data. So when you planning to do your research, for example, it's small, to answer your research question, you need to use like smaller database. You can design it at RedCap. Yes, you need to think like requirements. How information will be recorded in your database? What will be recorded? Who can access the information? How private information will be saved? What variables you're going to create? Do you want to divide your database in separate tables, like for each model of the survey? You want to have one table? All those decisions should be done. So why it's done? So for example, if you send me your database to do analysis based on your metadata and how your database is structured, I should be able to understand everything from the documentation and not ask you questions. So accessible means when you share the data, that is understandable both by machines and humans. So if someone reads about the data, they understand what it is. But for example, I have a lot of processes that I use macros to automate it. So it's why I ask specific structure of data dictionary, because if the data dictionary structures the way I want, I click the button and I have a summary table in hour and a half. Yes, so it's accessible not by person. I need to understand the data, but it should be structured in the ways that running simple program, I can modify the data or answer specific question in relatively short time. Of course, whatever you collected should be analyzable, because otherwise you cannot interpret the data, and also reusable. And I'm going to talk about it later. So basically it's secondary use of data. Yes, you did survey to answer specific questions, but there are additional information in the surveys that you can reuse to answer different question, or you can link your information from the survey with admin data to look on the data on a different way, or confirm something, or develop specific indicators or algorithms. So when you, like, I talk about it mostly from data perspective, but I think if you develop research question and you don't have appropriate data to answer question, all the time you spend on literature review and everything else will be a waste of time. All those should be connected. So here I just put this short summary for the research question. It should be specific, feasible, original, relevant, complex, researchable, and focus. You need to know clearly what you want to do, and the clarity will guide your research design, methodology, and analysis. You usually start with some broad idea, but after you conduct in literature review, you can narrow it down and map research opportunities, like smaller research opportunities, and develop more defined research question. You can use PICO, as I showed. You can use PICO kind of to help develop your question. You must to consider privacy, and you must to think about the data. So now when your research question is developed, The next step, like you said, oh, this is what I'm going to do. Your supervisor approve it, or you decided it's like the best way to do it. You're really happy with your research question. Usually, if we design in the study, we need to write detailed study protocol. And some of the elements I included in study protocol can be incorporated in any grant proposal review, grant proposal submission, yes, because it's specific steps. You basically, it's a blueprint of your study, what you're going to do, why you're going to do, how you're going to do. And very well, not very well, good and very and a good design protocol, well-designed protocol help you organize your thought, incorporate ethical consideration, and make your research reproducible. So basically, if you did something in Canada and someone wanted to do the same research in different countries to see if they have the same results, the way you study design can help other people to reproduce it. So I wrote here links directed to your final paper, but it can be like any final output product. Maybe you're designing some software, or yeah, you're thinking about the AI tool or something else, clinical trials, anything. So, but here I wrote the paper because 90% of what I do, it's actually to write and publish a paper for researchers and trainees, but it should directly be linked to your final output from rational to analysis. So basically you explain all the steps. So basically it's kind of, for the paper, it's kind of you outline for your paper, but the outlines that it's very, very detailed. And usually study protocols are important when you submit ethical reviews, you want to obtain finding, or you want to, like, you're working with different teams and you want to clearly communicate with them. It can be a very helpful tool. So what study protocol include? You probably all know it. We need the title. Sometimes we do the nickname or acronym. So for quick reference, for example, like with menopause, so we come up with HRBC. It's very good to write the protocol version and date, because protocols can change and later you would not know what the changes are. So every time the protocol updated, it's good to put like who updated the protocol on what date and what version it is, so you can track it back. Of course, you can use track changes, but I think after like you did first draft of your protocol, you send it to your team and everyone wrote your notes, and you summarize everything together, you should remove the track changes and have the new version of your protocol. If you have multiple steps in your team, like different teams should review it, patient partners should review it, like it should be very organized. You need to include all the principal investigators, sponsors and funding, contact information if someone wants to contact you. Study site allocation can be one and multiple. And sometimes you write the study protocol for studies that already approved. For example, you have ethics number and certificate, but you did some small addendum to your ethics. So the study already approved, you're doing something additional. So you need to include, like, if the study was approved, then what was ethics number. Background in rationale. So basically, I think this is the most important part of your study protocol, because it's actually explaining what you're going to do. And it's related to our previous document, problem and research gaps, literature review theory, timing, and what you need to the study. You already, when you develop research question, you actually had all this information. And if you put it in tables and wrote it down and organize, your background and rationale part of your study protocol, it's already there because you have all the information. You just need to write it in very short and concise way. And here I want to add for if you new in submitting grant application. like you have all this cool idea and you write it very long and interesting background and rational, but basically the way I do literature grant review, I look at first several sentences. If I say like, oh, they know exactly what they're doing because background and rationale, it's very concise and not very detailed, but to the point. You understand exactly what the research proposal is. I'm going to read it as like more details because it catch my eye. But if background is not messed up, like going rounds and rounds, and it's a lot of information, and some information actually not relevant to what you're going to do, it's taken from it away. So you did all this like extensive work for developing research question, but you need to also learn how to write it in very concise way. So other people that maybe not an expert in your area will understand exactly what is the background, what is rational for your future work, and what you're planning to do. Type of objectives. So you all know that there are primary objective and secondary objective. So primary objective represents central purpose of your study. It's basically summary of your main research question. And secondary objective can explore additional outcomes. So basically you say, oh, this is my primary objective. I'm going to look on timing between first and second birth for women with miscarriages. But also I would like to, my secondary objective will be, I would like to learn if actually women that maybe had miscarriage but after that had one baby, what will, if they will have another baby. So basically incidence of having an additional child. Yeah, it can be a secondary objective. Clearly stating both types of objective will strengthen your protocol and guide your study design. Based on the objective you want to study, you will be able do informal sample size calculation and align your data collection with your analytical plan. So objectives are the must. So objective also is research questions should be specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. So basically, when you develop research question, you thought about all those things, and your objective is actually things that you're going to do to answer your research question, but same qualifications as you applied for research question are relevant for the defining objective. Study design. As we statisticians say, if you developing something, ask statistician before you do it, because study design is crucial. If you had excellent research question and you got money and you can do whatever you want, if your study design is wrong, you probably will not be able to get to the results, or you get results that you're not expecting. So study design, in my opinion, it's the most important. It's the most important part of your study protocol. So, and here I give several examples. So, most common study designs are RCT, randomized controlled trials. You can have cohort studies, case control studies, cross-sectional surveys, longitudinal surveys, and I had a lecture about like analytical framework and study designs when I talk about those in a lot of details with examples. So if you're not familiar with any of them, you can go there and review the lecture and look for the study design you're interested in. Also, very important to understand what is your study population, inclusion criteria and exclusion criteria. I give you example. For example, you look at something related to fertility or birth. You only can include women and fertility age. And based on Stat Canada's definition here, it's usually between 15 to 49. For example, sometimes for this specification, sometimes I use from 15 to 45. If I want to, if it's longitudinal study and I want to predict something in the future, even based on the retrospective data, I can narrow down my age. or other like hormone therapy. Who is going to access hormonal therapy? Probably a woman in menopause or premenopause age, yes, and others. So you need to be very clear who include. For example, for some studies, you want to have naive patients that never were exposed to specific treatment or specific intervention. And there's a lot of consideration, but you need to think about those things in advance. For example, you studying someone with specific diagnosis, like specific disease or something like this. And exclusion criteria, you need to, inclusion criteria, you also kind of, I call it what going to contaminate your results. Yes, like there are sometimes individuals that you disqualify. For example, for HRBC survey, we looked on premenopause and menopause women, we restricted them by age. So if a participant completed survey and based on date of birth, we calculated age not in our defined age range, those people were excluded from the analysis. And there can be different characteristics. So you need to know for sure who you're including in the study. And the purpose here, I think, in terms of statistics, not contaminate your population for some characteristics that can mask your results or bias your results. Study settings. Most of the studies are usually done in one site, but sometimes our study design can be in multiple settings, like multiple clinics or multiple hospital. So you need to explain, like, if you're going to use single and multi-site, because it can change your sample size or your population diversity. Yes, for example, I don't know, when we recruited for the survey, yes, we wanted to recruit people from, not just from Lower Mainland, but the more rural areas. So we targeted our recruitment for specific centers. Yes, so maybe you need to explain why you want to have single site, and you need to justify why you're going to use multiple sites. So why it matters: setting influences feasibility, generalizability, and data collection logistic. It helps to determine how the intervention will be delivered. For example, what you can do, you can have schools that several randomly assigned schools will do one program, and in other schools you will run another program, and later you're going to compare them. Yes, there is different stratified sample design or other sample hierarchical sample design, and design of your sample and study settings are really correlated. And if you have multiple sites, you need to develop different programs or intervention are delivered for different sites. You need to actually note if protocol will be different from different, like infrastructure different, maybe a different population characteristic. And you need to state who will be leading the site and who, it's this in multiple sites, in each site, who will be responsible for coordination, training, running the intervention and doing control. So the next very important objective of your study design is basically the methods you're going to use. Yes, so it's why we need primary and secondary objective, and we need study design. So basically what objective we want to answer, how we're going to structure the study, and based on those two, what methodology we're going to use to answer the question. Methodology should be, it's basically a clear and structured plan for data collection, that your data collected consistent and data is reliable. And it will help you to validate your finding, and it will be aligned with your objective. For multiple site studies, explain the value. Yes, why you're going to use multiple sites in your methodology again. Define the outcomes. Describe secondary outcomes, identify and justify covariates and confounders, and specify any measures. Like, I truly suggest if someone did something and there is like validated measures, it's much easier to use validated measures unless you develop in your own scale for something. A detailed and thoughtful designed methodology ensures the data collected is both relevant and robust. And the methodology section will provide meaningful foundation for your future analysis and interpretation of your data. So additional information you can include in your protocol, it's depending on the settings. You can include data management protocol. It can be very detailed for large studies, so half page, how the data will be managed, who collects the data, where that data is going to be stored, what are the cleaning procedures, how will the quality assurance procedures will be done, when data will be collected, how data will be collected. You also need to think about statistical plan. So basically you need to plan how you are going to evaluate or analyze and answer your questions. So basically it includes description of preliminary, primary, secondary sensitivity analysis. What is preliminary analysis? Because you never saw your data before, you only have research question and hypothesis or thought in mind. You need to do like basic descriptive analysis of your sample to see what you get. Maybe there's something interesting. After that, you do primary analysis. So basically, it's the main analysis of your paper. Secondary analysis usually done if you see something and you need to include subgroup analysis, so something more specific, you're going further for secondary analysis. And for some models, for example, you receive results with one model, but you had several outliers and you excluded outliers. The review is probably will ask, oh, but you removed outliers. How is going to affect your model? So if you present like model with and without outliers, you will call it sensitivity analysis, and you can say, oh, we removed outliers and we added them and nothing changed, so our results are still robust. Also, you need to include additional ethical consideration. How you going to implement your study, who is going to monitor your study, how you're going to disseminate your results, and then also like budget limitation and any additional information. So now we're going to hypothesis testing. I'm not going to spend a lot of time about it because we have lecture I called a lecture about p-values, where I talked extensively about hypothesis testing in a lot of details. And I also explain why I don't think p-value, it's not the most important thing in statistics, although everyone talking about statistical significance. And also most of the papers published, unfortunately, are those that get statistically significant results. But this lecture is really related to hypothesis testing. So what is hypothesis testing? It's a natural extension of your grounded work. So you did everything, you wrote everything, you thought about everything, and now actually you need to summarize it for something that I can analyze for you. What is your hypothesis? Hypothesis also important because it transforms the research question in something statistically testable and tangible. Yes, you had all those ideas, but now we actually need to translate it to something mathematical as mathematical model and answer your question using some additional tool. And in essence, it should be rigorous preparation, ensuring that results are valid. So if you had invalid hypothesis, it probably will be very hard to answer your research question. So what are hypothesis testing steps? We need to define the null and additional hypothesis. We need to decide if we're doing one or two tails. What is one tail? For example, we say the mean of those groups are the same. It will be two-tailed, yes, because mean of one can be lower and another higher. But if you say, oh, we think the mean in this group will be larger than another, it will be one-tailed test. Based on your data, and this is what we talk about in our statistical test lecture, Basically, you need to decide which test you're going to use, what type of distribution you have, which groups you're going to compare, and it's basically based from your study protocol and study design. For any model or test, you need to check the assumption. We also talked about it. You run the model. For your study, you need to predetermine p-value in advance. Yes, usually, especially in medicine, you say, oh, we're going to compare everything for p-value. In social science, sometimes it's different. For example, I had reports that we use any p-value, 10%, 5%, and 1%, and we just put different stars. We say, oh, this was significant with p-value of 0.5%, and this one was significant with 10%, and this one was significant. But it's preferable that you state what will be your cutoff in advance. And determining p-value will going to help you to decide if you have statistical or practical significance. And this is what I mean. For example, you run an analysis and your age is very significant. For 1 point increase in age, something increased by 2 points, then it's very significant. But if you have million people in your sample, probably this statistical significance will not be relevant. So when you look at something, oh, it's statistically significant, but actually, is it meaningful in terms of practical significance or clinical? So for example, if you're not specialist in specific area or only learning, it may be a good idea to talk to someone with more experience. Say, oh, I got those cool results, but actually, is it meaningful? And when you do hypothesis testing, you also can use different modeling techniques. It's the most commonly used is exploratory analysis, confounding analysis, and predictive analysis. So explanatory analysis, so basically you don't know what happened. You have different covariates and different independent variables, and your main or secondary outcome, you're just looking for the relationship. You say, oh, those covariates or independent variables affecting the outcome in this way. When you do confounding, usually you have something that called main exposure. For example, you didn't do clinical trials, but two groups in your analysis have different interventions. Yes, so your intervention, it will be main exposure, but because you run intervention, for example, in different settings, you look for confounders for this main exposure to see how they affect results. So the difference statistically between explanatory confounding model, usually when you present the explanatory model, you include unadjusted and adjusted estimates, and it's important which independent variables were significant in both unadjusted and adjusted estimates. And usually you do model reduction, so stepwise, forward, backslash, whatever you want to use. For confounding model, usually you only need to report how your confounder changed when it's adjusted. You don't need to include table. And in the table, and something was significant and now it's not significant, it's not actually not so important. And predictive model, when you try to forecast or predict something. Those are the main ones. There is additional many different techniques. So if you need help to decide what you're going to use in your analysis, you can always come to me. So basically here I summarize exactly what I said before, but in more like concise way. We need to review protocol. We develop a hypothesis based on protocol. After we decide about everything, we prepare data, and data, I talked about it at my first lecture of data. So basically I use raw data, clean raw data. So basically almost nothing changed, just validate the data, transform data. So I can change from short form to long term, modify some data sets, combine table, divide table. But after all those transformed clean data sets are right there, I can create final analytical files for different analyses. It's very good to have metadata. So basically, when you clean your data, you document everything, and your data should include data dictionaries, any linkages, how data tables link, or how data is formatted. So if someone doesn't know a lot about data, can understand. And when you do a basic data review, of course, you need to look on missing values, outliers, and if your data is consistent. So basically, most important thing when you doing hypothesis testing is document everything. You make a decision to exclude missing, you need to write it. You had outliers and you went to patient chart and made decision about specific people to change their, I don't know, GFR or some other clinical outcome. You document everything else. Whatever you see, whatever you do, you document. Because first of all, later you will not know what you did. And also when you write, the decisions you make through the process are going to help you to add limitation or decide about sensitivity analysis. So I think documentation when you doing hypothesis testing and analysis, it's the most important thing. So basically you write what hypothesis you decided to test, what decision you made, what tests you used, what software you used, what data sets you used, like scripts. So basically I document everything. So in my scripts, I write what the project is and I save my programs in order. First is data preparation, second descriptive analysis. So later I can find anything. For larger analysis, for example, I cleaned and analyzed some of herbicide data. I documented everything and all the decisions that made. And I have a table that basically say what was the raw data set I used, what was the script, my program or script name, what the program did, what output is created, and for what I'm going to use output, because it's a lot of information. And 10 days later, I'm not going to remember what was the name of the program, especially if project is large and there is a lot of information. So now we tested our hypothesis, we did everything right. We need to get to the final stage of our production, and it's a paper. So basically here I'm talking mostly about publication, because as I said, 90+% of what I do resulted in publications. But technically, some of the aspects of this document can be relevant to any other final product. So publication is the final product. And if your study was well planned and you did, as I say, for statistics, everything by the book, you thought about not all, you cannot think about everything possible and predict everything, but you put a lot of efforts and you thought of the most things and everything was well planned, you shouldn't have any problem to write a good paper. So a strong manuscript communicates credibility, integrity, and relevance. Basically, writing is integration and not intervention. You already did a lot of work and now you need to put all of it together. And each section in your paper will be related to all the information and documents that were prior. You develop your research question and you have background. So basically it's kind of your introduction, because you've written all the protocols and other additional things. It will be useful for your method section. Yes, hypothesis testing, everything will go to method section. And based on this one, you can get to this, you summarize your results and you get discussion. All those steps now ensure transparency and recognition of your research and can be finalized in rigorous whole paper. So I think if you, from the beginning, you are organized and did everything by the book and documented everything and make all decisions, it shouldn't take you more than 3 days to write a paper. Planning your manuscript. So it's basically built on our previous work. Research question, we have SMART objective. Protocol, study design and analysis plan, hypothesis, testable statements and models. Each section of your paper will map back for the previous documentation and the work you do. So basically, you're not starting from scratch here, or I need to write something. It's not like high school or when you need to write a paper in last 24 hours, because it's rigorous research. You're following your previous steps to get to the final product. So my tip to writing is assembling a narrative, not just listing the results. Yes. So basically here I want to say, actually, when I write my papers, I first write method section and results. After this is done, I write introduction and discussion. And when it's done, I write the abstract. But it's my preferable because I work most with the data. For me, writing method section and results, it's very easy, but it will take me more time to add introduction and discussion. So you need to come up with clear, concise titles that reflect your objective and outcome. Abstract depends on the journal, and you need to think about the journal you want to publish in advance, because as I said before in one of the lectures, different journals, they have different rules and what they want. For example, I remember I published in BMC, the specific public, I think public health BMC or something like this, they requested stratification by age and sex and gender right away. So you needed to submit it with your paper, otherwise they will not accept it. So you need to have the journal in mind, and based on the journal instructions, you will structure your abstract. So I say abstract is also always written last, and also after you co-authors and your supervisors review it, because you don't want to rewrite it several times and spend time. So after that, we're going to do introduction. Again, we use what we already have, background, knowledge gap, research aims. We can reuse the logic from our research question development from literature review. And I say you can have secondary objective, but I think when you write the paper, it should be clear one objective with some sub-analysis. If you have multiple objectives, paper will be very complicated and it will be harder to publish it, and you will have more reviewers' comments because it's maybe sometimes hard to understand. So if you have a lot of results and a lot of interesting thing to present, maybe consider to divide your manuscripts in several. Also, I think there is an option in some journals that you submit like different related papers and at once, and they publish it either in one journal or consecutive journals. So you need to think about it. Methods. So basically your methods is your study protocol. Inclusion criteria, intervention, outcomes, ethics, analysis, and it's tailored to your specific studies. What else? Results, presenting results is clarity. What I see a lot sometimes, especially for researchers or trainees that didn't write a lot of papers, they include the discussion with the results. No, results is very simple. You just summarize what you received. So you have descriptive statistics of study population. You have comparison, like I usually call it table 1. You have two groups of people with early bleeding, without early bleeding, and you compare them and you describe how your groups are different. So after that, primary and secondary outcomes, basically it's your main research. So you present effect estimates if relevant, p-values and confidence intervals. What effect estimates? Sometimes you have the significant results, but you know that your sample size is small. It may be a good idea to estimate effect size if it's actually meaningful. Although between statisticians we have huge discussion if it's not necessary, if it's necessary, and if it's actually adding something new to what you already do. But you need to decide like what estimate you're going to include. And you usually, I call it table 2, you put your modeling results, adjusted and adjusted. If you did descriptive analysis or you need to explain something, sometimes it's very good to add visuals. So in terms of modeling here, my suggestion is, for example, if you had a model and you decided to exclude some of independent variables, my suggestion is to include full model in the paper, even if you decide to go to main section with reduced model. Because reviewers will ask you, oh, but you use stepwise selection and you reduce the model, but we would like to see if you didn't alter the results. So actually, usually I If I put reduced model in the manuscript, I say that sensitivity analysis was done and full model is presented in supplementary materials. Or if I had several models, yeah, I remove different variables on different stages, I can do the summary of my progress and add it to supplementary materials. Well, because it's stronger new papers and you get less comments from the reviewers. Discussion. You need to interpret your results in the context of existing literature. You need to acknowledge the strengths and limitations of your paper. And every paper that you write will have limitation. Only because you did specific statistical analysis, it's already half of the page of limitation. And if you need to help with the limitation section, you always can come to me again. You can discuss implication for policy, practice, or future research. So you don't just summarize your results in discussion way, you also add cohesive interpretation. You compare to information with existing literature, if your results are similar or different. If you do something that no one did before, you write like how your results are novel and what it adds. So it should be, I saw papers when people send me discussion, it was very cool, but it looked like bullet points without kind of any cohesion or like story. Because I think discussion basically is a story of whatever you did. You presented your results and now you discuss and you're telling the story about your results. And of course, conclusion should, it's from high school, conclusion should reconnect to original research question. And conclusion should be very short. Yes, conclusion, we did this is what received, this is impact on our funding and how it's reflected on our laid out goals and research questions protocols. So conclusion should be very, very short. So you're done with your paper. So what else? It's coming more recently because I personally didn't see it a lot, but now I reviewed several WHRI grants and people adding checklists to their papers. What is checklist? On actual document, I explain in more details what it is, and I also have a links to specific checklist. So STROP, it's a checklist for observational studies. What your observational studies, like what you should do. Tripod, it's for prediction models. There is different one, but this is the ones I'm familiar. Consort, it's for clinical trials. So adding a checklist, although you don't need to write everything from the checklist to your paper, sometimes you do, but you can say that this checklist you use and this is what you got in strengthens you specific statistical analysis. Also, when you submit the grant proposals, those are very good. You say we're going to use this checklist for observational studies. It means that you know what you're doing and you're doing a rigorous job. In addition to, at the end of the paper, you usually include like acknowledgement, funding, conflict of interest, and you include only a lot of, you can include supplementary materials. But here's the difference. Before, most of the journals publish actually on paper. Now, most of the journals publish online. Yes, and when you publish online, you think, oh, everything I have, I can add to supplementary materials. No one is going to read them. So you only include in some supplementary materials things that strengthen your paper and you cannot put in the main body of your paper, but the strengthens. For example, you did sensitivity analysis and additional models. You did something on checklist. You can put, if you use specific measurements, for example, there's measurement scale and there's reduced measurement scales, like original scale had 35 questions and now the one you use had 12 questions and it's validated. You can include like what measurements you use and additional things you use in supplementary materials. but don't put everything you ever did in supplementary materials because it's going to confuse and no one needs it. But this is my personal opinion. So we're almost at the time, so summary. So actually what I did, I introduced the analytical, I call it WHRI analytical framework because I think it's a framework because it's structuring our research and what you do from the beginning to end. And you are welcome. The documents are downloadable and they're very detailed. So I think like I only describe a little bit what I wrote about, but I really suggest you to go and look. And from now on, if which I remember are going to send me study protocol, and if I read it and I see it's not the best, I'm going to send it right away back, say, oh, review the documents and write it more or less based on documents. Of course, there are exclusions, and sometimes we have research or analysis or ideas that not fit for the what everyone else does, like for 99% of research we do. So this way, of course, we have a lot of resources for developing managers that can help you develop protocols and a KT and additional resources. But please review those documents, and when you try to write it in some kind of consistent and organized way, because I personally, when I read your research proposal, especially for younger researchers or your study protocols, I spent a lot of time of the things that technically it's already in document. And it's also one of the reasons I created those documents, because I want to save my time. I want to concentrate on more rigorous and interesting research and look on new models and come up with new ideas. But if I read half of the day bad study protocols, I think it's waste of time. Of course, we're all here to learn, but I think like if you review all the resources we published, it will help you to do the better first draft version right away. And here I also going to talk about next steps. So I'm thinking about next season lectures. I'm still not sure if you're going to do it September or spring. But because we covered most of the most simple and analytical topics like simple model, like linear logistic regression or survival and basic survival analysis, and we talked about tests and distributions, p-value, odds ratios, hazard ratios, and everything else, like very basic topics. And next year I'll probably start with something more advanced, and I'm waiting for several papers we submitted to be published, because I did some I think interesting and cool analysis. So maybe because paper did be published, I can do lecture on the paper. So it's not research club, but or reading club, but paper can be sent in advance. So people will read it, and I'm going to talk about what's decision, like ARIMA model, structural equation model. I thought to talk maybe about administrative data, because a lot of researchers don't know how to approach administrative data or how properly work with survey data. I still didn't decide, but my thoughts are in progress. So stay tuned for the next announcement for the next session. So I'm planning to do additional documents, and I will do it as I go. For example, recently I have several requests for calculating more sophisticated clinical trial design, like non-inferiority trial or equivalency trial. So I'm thinking when I have time to put documents of how to calculate sample size to different clinical trials. And some other topics. So every time I will write the document, it will be edited or uploaded on our resource page. Also, if I see something interesting for other statistician I follow, or interesting book or interesting paper, it's going to be added there. So I hope that the page will be more living and more content will be added. Additional thing I want to do and to add codes with examples. For example, we talked about t-test or non-parametric test. I would like to find some publicly relevant use data and I write my codes in SAS and R, and I probably put it something like GitHub page, not on them. It will be private, so you will need to request permission to access it because I don't want it to be flying around. It's will be created for our members, but I'm going to write detailed code. So basically, as usually I do, I write what macro I had. Like if I use the macro, what code I use, code is very detailed with notes, and basically it's example how you should write proper code with when you have time, with like outputs and SAS and R, how to read the outputs, what's conclusion. So it basically will be kind of like tutorial, but of course it will take me time to do, but we're going to populate it as we go. Also, if you would like to request my statistical services, you need to submit the request. So it's very good that you send me an email, but without the request form, I'm not going to, I can communicate with you, but I prefer to have statistical service request form because a lot of information I needed to start about with your analysis, it's there. Also, please review guidelines for data dictionary, how they're structured. And if you're sending me if you giving me some data, if it's not based off what I expect it to be, there's like if it's not like registry data, administrative data is different. No one should touch it. But if you have small project, I would expect the data and data dictionary be presented in the way I prefer, because all my, as I said, all my procedures are automated. Yeah, so this way you'll get your results faster and everything done correctly. And also on our service page, to remind you, there is SOP. So basically it's explained how you should fill a request form. So please read it before you submit statistical services. Additional thing I'm planning, maybe not to write statistical tips, but short post about statistics or some issues with the analysis or something I think about with coordination with our amazing communication departments. This will be posted on social media. So please follow us on our social media tag. And thank you. That's it. We finished the season. So if you have questions, please let me know.
Thanks, Sabina. Wonderful presentation.
Yeah, and it was like a lot of information with very short time, but the documents are very detailed, like with a lot of bullet points and additional resources and examples. So I think like maybe for this specific lecture, if you go and read the documents and have specific question targeted to a specific analysis or specific part of the documentation, then you can contact me and I can help you with whatever needed.
Fantastic. And I just popped the research resources in the chat for folks to find it. But yeah, thank you all. And thank you, Sabina, for another wonderful last presentation today.
Yeah, and we're going to add the link to the resource pages to the uploaded version of